Hi guys, I hope everybody's doing well today. Today's topic is going to be legal research and sources of law. So first of all, what are your objectives of legal research? Well, your whole point in life when you work at a law firm is to serve your clients. And you want to do what's best for your clients. And in order to do that, you need to really understand the legal issues that your client faces. So throughout this PowerPoint, I'm going to give you an example of a situation that actually is based on a true story. And there was a client that came into an office that I worked in several years ago, and he had been charged with leaving the scene of an accident. And here are the facts, just very, very quickly. Every morning he would leave at 5 o'clock in the morning to go to work, and he had a very large, like 1970s style car. It was very big, and it didn't really feel the road very well. But he had a huge pothole at the end of his driveway. So every morning he would back out, he would hit this pothole, his car would almost bottom out in the pothole, and then he would drive off to work. Well, you know, 5 o'clock in the morning, it's sometimes it's foggy, it's definitely still dark. Well, one morning, he pulls out, he backs out of his driveway as always, and he hits that pothole as always, and then he drives to work. Well, when he gets to work, he's being arrested for leaving the scene of an accident causing injury. And unfortunately, what had happened is that the child of his neighbor, who was about 2 years old at the time, had gotten out of the house while her mom was getting up and preparing breakfast, and had went to go retrieve something in the man's yard, and was toddling across the end of his driveway. And just as he hit that pothole, he also hit the child. He had absolutely no idea that he had hit the child, and then he drove off and he went to work. Well, his case found its way to that law firm where I was working, and the question became, do you have to have knowledge that you were actually in an accident before you can be charged with leaving the scene of one? And obviously it was a really unfortunate incident, but we needed to research the law. So I give you this example at the beginning of this PowerPoint because I want you to realize that your legal research is very important on a number of different levels. So first of all, the question became, okay, what type of system is this going to be in? Well, it was a state criminal case. So we would be looking, our research would be looking at state criminal cases. So for the second thing on this PowerPoint slide, what substantive law was involved? Well, it's going to be statutory and case law, both at the state level. And then the third thing we had to figure out, was there any procedural law involved? I mean, did the indictment have to state that, or the criminal complaint, did it have to state that he had knowledge? Procedurally, is the state going to have the burden of proof to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew that he was actually in an accident before he could be charged with leaving the scene of one? So all of these things came into play when we were trying to determine where to start our research. So you also have to understand that there are some things that the court must follow. Those are called precedent, and that is under category 1 on this slide. That is called primary authority or mandatory authority. The judge has no discretion. They have to follow the case law that came before, and they have to follow the statutes. So that makes up the primary, the mandatory law. And then there's something called secondary or persuasive authority. This is the authority that judges will look to if they're not really sure that the jurisdiction that they're in has adequately answered the question for them. So sometimes they will look to see what other states have done on that issue if there is no law existing in their jurisdiction that covers that point. So we're going to look at sources of primary law first. So primary law, like I said, is mandatory. And it depends on what type of legal system that you're in, but all the legal systems, whether it's federal or state or local, they all have mandatory law that they must follow. But just keep in mind that, you know, West Virginia only has to follow West Virginia law and federal law. Pennsylvania is not required to follow West Virginia law, and West Virginia is not required to follow Pennsylvania law. So you have to understand what jurisdiction that you're in, and that there are 50 different states And there are many local systems within those states. So let's look at constitutional law. Constitutional law, you've got your United States Constitution, but each of the 50 states has their own constitution. Almost all of them nearly identically mirror the United States Constitution, but please know that your state has a constitutional law system. There's also statutory law. These are the statutes that are written by the legislature, and each state has a legislative body that writes laws. That's mandatory. Then you have case law, or sometimes referred to as common law, and these are where a statute has already been written. There is a statute that says leaving the scene of an accident is against the law. And then what will happen is whenever courts try to apply that to a particular individual, sometimes the individual will appeal and say, you applied this to me incorrectly. And then the Supreme Court of West Virginia will look at that and they will say, yeah, you're right. It was applied incorrectly to you. And that creates case law. Those opinions, that interpretation of the statute applied to a particular set of facts becomes what's called case law. And case law is mandatory precedent in most cases. And then there's something called an executive action, which is also mandatory, and that would be something that the president or the governor actually signed. Those are rare, and they don't, they're not going to come into play on a regular basis for you in a law office, but you do need to know that they exist. Okay, so what about procedural law? What procedural law is mandatory? Well, in West Virginia, we follow our procedural rules. That would be like the West Virginia Rules of Evidence, the West Virginia Rules of Criminal Procedure, etc., etc. There are also federal laws that if you were in federal court, you would need to follow, and those are the federal rules, and I've got them listed here on this slide. That's how you do something. How you sue somebody, how you arrest somebody, that type of thing. So primary law, the way it is actually recorded, it's nearly the same thing that was listed on those other slides, is that you've got your Constitution. You can look to the Constitution, you can look to the statutes. The United States Constitution is found at the front of the United States Code, and then the state constitutions are found in your state's statutory code. Statutes are found in the code of the state in which you live. However, before they are actually published in the code, they go through a process, and when it's first being introduced by the legislature, it's called a bill. Once that bill is enacted by the legislature, it becomes what is called a slip law. And so this is kind of the process that it goes through. First it's a bill, then it becomes a slip law because it's been enacted by the legislature. And then while that legislature is still in session, it is published, and then it's called session laws because they're still in session, which is why it's called a session law. Once the session is over, that session of Congress, once it's completed and that session law is published, it becomes called a statute. So that's just some definition of terms there for you. Federal session laws are published in what is called the statutes at large. When you think about meaning, oh, that's somebody is at large, that criminal is at large, it means they're out there, right? And the police are looking for them. Well, statutes at large are laws that are out there and they haven't been captured yet and put into that code. So they've been enacted, but they haven't really been captured. So they're considered statutes at large until they're actually published in the United States Code. Again, just some more definitions for you. Other types of primary law are things like administrative rules and regulations. Administrative agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Department of Health and Human Resources or the Centers for Disease Control, these are administrative agencies and they have their own rules and they are mandatory if you were trying to do something with that particular agency. Those rules are all included in what's called the Federal Register. When they are adopted by the administrative agency, they find themselves in the Federal Register. Later on, much like the session laws, they get published into a code section. So once they're published in that code, you can find them in the Code of Federal Regulations, which most attorneys will refer to as the CFR. Case law, whenever it's first decided, again, we're going to use that word slip. There's something called a slip opinion. It's when the case is first decided, but it hasn't really been published yet in the official reporters, the case reporters. And you can find them in this loose leaf. They're actually like 3-ring binders at the library, the law library, and they're called advance sheets. So a slip opinion is just something that has been decided. It is the law, but it hasn't made its way into that hardback book yet. Once it makes its way into the hardback book, which are called case reporters, you'll find it there. Okay, so the United States Supreme Court, they keep their cases in something called the United States Report. You can also find them in the Supreme Court Reporter and the United States Supreme Court Reporter, or the Lawyer's Edition. So that's where you're going to find Supreme Court cases, the United States Supreme Court cases. There are also courts of appeal, like the Fourth Circuit, which is the one that West Virginia belongs to. You've got the Ninth Circuit, which is where California is. So there's all these circuits. Those are called the United States Courts of Appeals. That's what those courts are. And you will find those in what's called the Federal Reporter. Courts lower than those, like the Fourth Circuit, would be, for example, in West Virginia, the Northern District of West Virginia or the Southern District of West Virginia. Those are considered district courts, and you will find opinions from those judges find their way in what's called the Federal Supplement. And then finally, you have federal specialty courts, and those are going to be things like bankruptcy courts and those types of things. So those have their own reporter. Okay. State case reporters. This is where you would find a West Virginia case. So we have the West Virginia Reporter. Pennsylvania has theirs. Maryland has theirs. Each state has their own reporter. But also West Publishing has created what are called regional reporters. So you can go to a reporter and cases from a few different states are found in those. West Virginia happens to be included in the Southeastern reporters. So you can find our cases, our case law, not only in the West Virginia reporters, but you can find them in the Southeastern reporter. And then you can see when you look at this definition here that there's the Atlantic reporter and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different regions. So understanding the case law. When you look at a case, understand that it is a decision of the court. Okay, you're going to need the court's disposition. Did they affirm the ruling of the lower court? Did they overturn it? What did they do? The court's opinion is where they explain how they came up with their answer, how they came up with their decision. There are different types of court opinions. You could have a majority court opinion, concurring or dissenting. You might have what's called a per curiam opinion. A per curiam opinion is where that no particular judge signed off on it. So in many cases that does not become precedent. It just applies to the parties in that particular case. And sometimes the courts, they have what's called a standard of review. This is how they look at what the lower court did. If the lower court made a decision, the Supreme Court looks at it and they have directions or instructions on how to review this. And they might review the lower court's decision, what's called de novo, which means of the new, or de novo on the record, which means of the new, but we're only going to look at was the evidence that was admitted at court below, or on the record only. And then they can figure out, okay, I'm not looking at this from brand new eyes. I'm going to look at it through the eyes of the lower court judge and see whether or not they abused their discretion or if they were a good judge. Okay, elements of a reported case. You're going to see things called a caption, a date of decision. All of these things you would have gone over in your legal research and writing 1 and 2 class. And again, if you have any specific questions about the elements of a case and what's in it, please ask your instructor. Please contact me. We would be more than happy to help you. Okay, so what are your sources of secondary law when you're doing research? Secondary law consists of legal authorities that they're not mandatory. It's not binding on the court. The court doesn't have to follow that. but sometimes it helps if they look to see, what happened with, Pennsylvania. How did Pennsylvania handle the situation? Do they require knowledge before you leave the scene of an accident? How does that work? Okay, so our sources of secondary law, I mentioned Pennsylvania. Other jurisdictions, what other states did, it's a very strong form of persuasive authority. It says, Your Honor, I know we don't have any rulings in West Virginia on this yet, but let's look and see what Pennsylvania did. Let's see what Maryland did. I mean, they're right next door. They're our neighbors. How did they handle this situation? So that can be very persuasive to the judge, but the judge doesn't have to follow it. Legal encyclopedias are things that are arranged by subject matter. It's just like your Encyclopedia Britannica or something. If you wanted to find research aardvarks, you would look up A for aardvark. Same thing with legal encyclopedias. If you want to look up the law on DUIs, you look up driving while under the influence, okay? And it will give you an overview of the topic, much like you would find in the Encyclopedia Britannica. American Law Reports, which is considered an annotated law reporter. Lawyers will refer to it as ALR. Okay, it publishes, it's kind of like a legal encyclopedia, but it refers you to all of the current case law. And so does those legal encyclopedias above. Corpus Juris Secundum, the lawyers refer to it as the CJS, I'm sorry. In American jurisprudence, lawyers refer to that as AmJur. Okay, so when they're speaking, you'll hear them say things like, oh, well, check the CJS or even AmJur. Or, well, you know what, let's look at the ALR. Okay, they all pretty much will lead you to the same information. Restatements are where legal scholars, and same thing with treatises, legal scholars sometimes will sit down, they're an expert in a field, and they will write a book about that area of the law. Dictionary, you know what that is, and periodicals are... they're like magazines, only they're written by legal professionals, and they're on a particular topic of the law. Again, these can all be used to try to persuade the judge. All right, that's all I have for this PowerPoint. I know it was a little bit lengthy, but I hope you got some good information. As always, if you have any questions, please ask your instructor or reach out to me. Have a good day.